And I was honored to be part of the initiative of the church to begin to present the harmful effects of the doctrine of discovery. And so I'm going to focus on it as it affected the Western Hemisphere, but also how it impacted Utah. Next slide. We're talking about before Columbus, and the area now known as the United States was populated by indigenous people of many nations and tribes with their own languages, social customs, and spiritual expressions. The U.S. indigenous population at the time of Columbus, 1492, is estimated to have been around at least 10 million people. Some people have said 1 million. Most folks, anthropologists, have agreed on the 10 million figure. Now, some suggest 100 million lived throughout the Western Hemisphere. And that, of course, comes from Charles C. Mann, his book, 1491, which is excellent reading for everyone. The U.S. indigenous population, this is the shocker, in 1890 was recorded at 249,000. So we're looking at 90% of our people died off from disease, but also warfare. And the North American conquest is traumatic, to say the least. Next slide. Genocide is intentional, systematic implement. It was systematically implemented from 1492 to 1890. There are different methods of enacting genocide with the objective of making a people disappear, perpetuated by initial European invaders in North America and continued by U.S. government and churches through assimilation processes, namely American boarding schools. Next slide, please. This is a copy of the official papal dictate that was issued during the time of exploration. Next slide. This was the dictum issued and by the Pope, which asserts rights to colonize, convert, and enslave. Dum de Versas, 1452, and Romanus Pontifex in 1454 were papal bulls issued by Pope Nicholas V and to King Alfonso V of Portugal, confirming to the crown of Portugal dominion over lands of Africa, along with encouraging the seizure of lands of the Turks and non-Christians. They granted permission for the enslavement of such people. So you can see this movement was taking place before Columbus was already exerted in the country of Africa. Next slide, please. Now, this is the one that was issued by Pope Alexander VI. It's called the Inter Cetera. This was the one in 1493, and it authorizes Spain and Portugal to colonize the Americas and its native peoples as discovered subjects. This was the first use of the term discovered. The decree asserts the rights of Spain and Portugal to colonize, convert, and enslave discovered Africans. Next slide, please. This is a rendition of Columbus. You can see he may not have his battle gear on, but his soldiers behind him are certainly prepared for wars should they encounter hostiles, which they did not. Next slide, please. Who was the savage? On that very monumental day when Columbus arrived on Hispaniola, according to Columbus's journal, the Taino Indians were kind and generous, childlike in fact. Colom, as he was referred to, also called them Indio, or in God in Spanish. Colomb, on the other hand, arrived with soldiers, battle ready with swords and shields. Colomb and the soldiers represented Christianity. The Taínos represented non-Christian heathens, the uncivilized. A critical judgment was made. That judgment would last to this day. The judgment was first and foremost, these people are weak. These people have nothing to offer. They are not human. The Taínos were more Christ-like, in fact, according to D. Brown's Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. They were kind, loving people. Now, not all the indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere were kind, but my observation has been that most of the native people who occupied the warmer climates of the Caribbean, where life was less challenging, tended to be more kind and Christ-like. Next slide, please. A patent was granted by King Henry VII to John Cabot and his sons in 1496. And this is how the Doctrine of Discovery is translated over to the English. By this public document, Henry VII indicated his official royal support for Cabot's enterprise. As an agent of the English crown, Cabot was empowered to investigate, claim, possess lands which before this time were unknown to all Christians, which meant he could not intrude on Spanish and Portuguese discoveries. The king would receive 1/5 of the value of merchandise brought back to Bristol, though he had invested no money of his own. And so there was kind of a chess match going on between the European nations at this time. Next slide, please. The theologically grounded philosophy of the Doctrine of Discovery was subsequently promulgated by European monarchies in order to legitimize the colonization of lands outside of Europe. The philosophy allowed European entities to seize lands inhabited by indigenous people with the justification of discovery, beginning in 1606. Now, one thing I need to mention here is that around this time, there was a lot of violent wars occurring. You had the Crusaders versus the Muslims, and later the Mongolian Empire. You had the War of Roses. You had the feudal wars before then. So a lot of violence was occurring. All wars over resources, as most wars are. You kind of have to keep that in mind as we look at this picture further. Next slide. This is another depiction, a little bit romanticized, probably not very accurate at all, except for some of the dress. Next slide, please. In 1792, U.S. Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson declared that the discovery philosophy would extend from Europe to the infant U.S. government. The doctrine and its legacy began to influence American imperialism and the treatment of indigenous peoples. This was taken from an Indigenous Peoples History in the United States, very outstanding book by Dunbar Cortez Roxanne. Next slide, please. Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration of Independence in 1776, referred to the indigenous peoples of the New World as merciless Indian savages, who would be specifically excluded from the principles of freedom and human rights declared in the document. Now, this is a kind of a strange situation here because both Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin were very fond of the Iroquois Confederacy and their own version of a declaration. Actually, it was their constitution. Some of the principles in that document were later adopted in the American Constitution. It is a subject of debate how much of that doctrine was borrowed from the White Roots of Peace document of the Iroquois. Next slide, please. In the 19th century, United States, the Doctrine of Discovery was specifically used conceptually in the debate of public international law, expounded by the U.S. Supreme Court in a series of decisions, most notably Johnson versus McIntosh in 1823. Next slide, please. Chief Justice John Marshall said that the right of discovery was well illustrated by the Royal Commission that England's King Henry VII gave to John Cabot and his sons. That commission instructed the Cabots to seek out, discover, find whatsoever islands, countries, and provinces of the heathens and infidels that before this time had been unknown to all Christian people. The U.S. Supreme Court called this claim a right of dominion. Now, all along, the hidden factor here, the suggestion that is also harmful, is that the Indian people are not human. Because they are not Christian, because they do not believe in God the same way Europeans do, they therefore are not human. They must not have souls. Here again, going back to that judgment of Columbus, they are weak, they are inhuman. That begins to take place in American law from this time on. Next slide, please. Chief Justice Marshall explained and applied the way that colonial powers laid claim to land belonging to foreign sovereign nations during the Age of Discovery. Under it, title to lands lay with the government whose subjects traveled to and occupied a territory whose inhabitants were not subjects of the European Christian monarchy. The doctrine has been primarily used to support decisions invalidating or ignoring indigenous possession of land in favor of colonial or post-colonial governments. And this goes back to the John Marshall Court era. Next slide, please. Now, interesting thing happens in this case, Worcester versus Georgia, 1832, because Marshall apparently changed his mind on the issue of indigenous tribal rights to land and ruled in favor of several southeastern U.S. native tribes that the U.S. must establish relations with them as sovereign nations. That decision continues to govern Indian law, federal Indian law to this day, the recognition of Indian tribes as sovereign nations within a nation. The problem is President Andrew at the time refused to support and enforce that decision. In fact, he defied it, even though it was a Supreme Court ruling, because the Cherokee, in fact, filed suit and won. That is the case. Worcester versus Georgia, 1832. The Trail of Tears followed. I'm sure some of you are familiar with the Trail of Tears. Cherokee were forced out of Georgia. My understanding is that gold was discovered in central Georgia, which prompted a lot of that greed for land and resources in that area. And so thousands, I've heard the figure 3,000 Cherokee died along the way on their trek to Oklahoma. Next slide, please. And here's the famous picture we see in all of our history books. Manifest Destiny, the spirit, she is a spirit, a female spirit that is behind a lot of the westward movement. Next slide. Manifest Destiny, a phrase coined in 1845, attributed to New York newspaper editor John O'Sullivan, expressed the philosophy that drove 19th century U.S. territorial expansion. Manifest Destiny held that the United States was destined by God to expand its dominion and spread democracy and capitalism across the entire North American continent. Next slide, please. Now the model, um, the solution for the Indian problem became the education of the Indian people. And so the Carlisle Indian Industrial School was established as a model. And it was intended to assimilate American Indians into the mainstream culture. Over 10,000 indigenous children attended the school between 1879 and 1918. Despite idealistic beginnings, the school left a mixed and lasting legacy, created opportunity for some students and conflicted identities for others. In this cemetery are 186 graves of the students who died while at Carlisle. Next slide. Now, Richard Henry Pratt was a general at the time, and he was put in charge of this program. And he coined this phrase: "What we have to do is kill the Indian and save the man, destroy the language and culture of the native people." The next slide kind of depicts this transition. Heather, next slide. Cut their hair, remove their clothing, put them in civilized dress and manner, and stop them from teaching their language or practicing their religion. I am a victim of that policy. My mother and father were both fluent in the Ute language. In fact, my mother was an interpreter for Anne Smith, who was an anthropologist who wrote Ute Tales and many other, published many other books on the Ute culture. But my mother was told by the education director of the tribe at the time that teaching me Ute would interfere in my mastery of English language. So I struggled with this throughout my life, but I'm here to tell you, I'm at the point in my life where I can say, well, you know, in a way, it's okay. It's a blessing because you know what? I can use the English language. I can articulate on behalf of my people. I can defend them. I can speak for them. And that's what I'm doing right now. Next slide. These are some of the graves at the Carlisle Institute. Next one. Next slide, please. Now, for our people, the Ute Indians, the discovery and history began in Utah in 1776 with Roman Catholic priests Dominguez and Escalante. Contrary to popular belief, the Utes of Utah Valley lived well, with 30% of their diets consisting of fish, trout from Utah Lake. Now, this is according to a book by On Mount Zion by Jared Farmer, outstanding book, Harvard Press. I'm very impressed with that book, and a graduate of University of Utah, Gregory. Now, the Utes, they're a branch of the Great Shoshone Nation, occupied most of the Great Basin. And it includes the other tribes would be the Eastern and Western Shoshone, the Bannock, Paiute, the Goshute, and the Comanche. A lot of folks don't know that the Comanche are really a Shoshonean people. If you ask the Comanche what tribe they belong to or what language, they'll tell you it's Shoshone. And so we were all a part of a great Shoshone nation. The lore claims that we have been here over 20,000 years. Some of you may be aware that there was a discovery of some petrified footprints in New Mexico recently, and were carbon dated to about 21,000 years. And so there's movement to support some of the lore, some of the tribes that claim to have been in this area for a long time. In fact, the Bering Straits theory is being debunked by most anthropologists, except for the late arrivals of the um, probably the Navajo, Apache, Aleuts, and Eskimos, some of the tribes that came over later, Athabascan speakers, Cree Indians. Those were more likely folks that came through the Bering Straits. But we're finding most of the tribes, um, such as Shoshone and the Hopi, who are our relatives, the Aztecs, all belonging to the Utah Aztecan language family, claim to be here, to have been here much longer. Some of the other tribes, like the Lakota, they also migrated from the south up through the Gulf coast, up the East Coast into the Great Lakes, and then eventually settling into the high plains. Many other tribes followed a similar suit. I talked to a person of the Arikara tribe, and they claim direct ancestry with the Maya people. And so we're learning more and more. We're filling in the gaps when it comes to ancient history of our people. In fact, the Shoshone people, the lore says that we are descended from the Chitimac people, an ancient people who once lived in Central America and migrated north. And other branches from that were not only the Shoshone, but the Hopi and the Aztec. The Utes only became destitute after they were displaced from Utah Valley. I'm talking about mainly Utah and not Colorado Ute history, because we do have relatives. We've always occupied Colorado as well. We had at one time we had 6 bands in Utah and 6 bands in Colorado. My father's people, in fact, come from the Yampa Valley area, also referred to as White River country in northwest Colorado. So, but I'm going to speak primarily about the Utes of Utah, since that is my home area. That's the area I'm most familiar with. Next slide, please. Now, in 1847, we have a group of immigrants called Mormons, or members of the Jesus Christ Church of Latter-day Saints. They moved into this area, most of them of English ancestry. Next slide. And what's interesting to note here is the Mormons and the Indians. I did a study back in 1986. I did a comparative analysis. I probably should have put a slide in here that showed that basically they were opposites. One group was very competitive. The other group was cooperative. One group practiced competitive economics. The Indians were socialists. They were egalitarian. The Mormons were very hierarchical. They were patriarchal. We were matriarchal. On down the line, they were opposite. Mormons explained things in scientific terms more often than the Indian people, who explained everything spiritually. I mean, one group viewed the world linear, sequential, and the Indian people viewed the world in wholes, holistically. Native people said all of these things in life are interrelated. The other groups scientifically looked at things as separate compartments. And so, again, the 2 groups were so different. I think the only areas of commonality were the belief in one God, monotheistic, the importance of family. And that's about it. There may have been some other areas. I don't know. But that was just an observation study that I conducted back in the 20th century. These are the indigenous tribes of Utah. Goshu. They have several bands, presently two. The Navajo are not related to the other tribes. They are Athabascan speakers, and they have a different culture. They have numerous clans rather than bands. The Northern Ute, originally 6 bands, presently there are 3. Northwest Band of Shoshone are also occupy Utah. The Paiute, there were several bands at one time, there are presently 3. Again, all of them are related except for the Navajo who live separate. They have a different language family. Here's a quote by Levi Jackman that kind of reflects the sentiment of the time. Another example of dehumanizing portrayal of the Indian people. And finally, they are the most filthy, degrade, and miserable beings perhaps that ever assumed the shape of human beings. And that's in their spelling. That's his spelling. So that kind of reflects the perception or view of our people. And it's changing slowly, but not fast enough, in my opinion. Next slide, please. These are the territories of the people. The Shawnee to the north, Goshutes in the western desert, the Ute people, most of central and eastern Utah, Paiute, far to the southwest, and the Navajo, south of the San Juan River, in the southeast part of the state. Next slide. Here's a quote from the Utah Territorial Governor, Brigham Young. To have dominion over them for their good, which is the duty of the elders, you must not treat them as your equals. You cannot exalt them by this process. If they are your equals, you cannot raise them up to you. So again, there's this perception that the Indian people are just not quite human. And they're certainly not up to the standard they need to be. So don't treat them as equals. That kind of set the tone for the relationship with the Mormon settlers, which eventually ended in war. Next slide, please.
Really? Interesting.
Now, the Mormons had a peculiar belief. They believed that that people of color have been cursed. This belief is referenced in the Book of Mormon, Nephi 2, which states that among the Hebrew people, there were 2 brothers, Nephi and Laman. According to this belief, the descendants of Laman became sinful and unpleasing to God, and God cursed them and their descendants with dark skin. These people came to be called Lamanites. They're considered to be ancestors of the American Indians and many of the Pacific Islander people. Regardless of any connection with the Mormon faith, many of these descendants have suffered racism and dehumanization under this designation. DNA analysis by Southerton has disproven the evidence of any Hebrew blood in any of the Native American people. I know Simon Southerton, and there's another scholar named Murphy, and I have discussed this book with them and Murphy's scholarship as well. And it's very interesting to note that there really is no evidence of Hebrew DNA among our people. Next slide, please. Now here's Brigham Young again, and you can see the subtleties in this message. We wish you to understand decidedly that if you're Utahns, he's referring to the Utes, and the different nations in this country do not injure any of our people in any of our settlements, that you will all be blessed, for we are sent here by the Great Spirit to teach you and to do all of you good. Be at peace with one another. Don't fight. but love one another, and you will soon be taught to become a great, united, and good people. And you will realize all the blessings that have been told you by your forefathers, and you will prove that we are the people whom you have long awaited and looked for. Now, that last statement is quite interesting. Brigham Young was aware that the Indian people were waiting for someone. I don't know, but I have a strong suspicion that he knew that the Roman Catholic priests, Dominguez and Escalante, promised the Utes that they would return. And so Brigham Young might have even been familiar with Dominguez and Escalante's journal and the maps of the area. He may have been well acquainted with what to expect upon entering Utah, and therefore making that statement, we are the people whom you have long waited and looked for. That's just kind of one of my suspicions. Anyway, next slide, please. Now, I mentioned earlier that most anthropologists claim that 80 to 90% of the native people in the Western Hemisphere died from diseases, and the Utes were no exception. And here's a quote by John Nebeker in 1884. They died off about as fast as they went into the water. Some they buried and some they didn't bury. I helped to bury those that were left unburied. We buried 36 in one grave and 44 dogs in another. Their custom was to kill their dogs when their masters died, including horses. This was the first time measles appeared here. It was a new disease to them, and they didn't know how to cure it or where they got it. He's referring to a hot sulfur springs located in North Salt Lake Valley. The Indians used this springs as a source of healing for different ailments. And this was a traumatic situation here in which their usual healing methods did not work. And this man witnessed it. And of course, this is only one group that encountered that suffering. The suffering occurred throughout the United States, especially the East Coast Indians died off like flies. And the diseases were numerous. It wasn't just the measles, smallpox. It was the common cold, common flu, along with other diseases. It's interesting that for a long time we were told that the Indians brought syphilis to the Europeans, and Charles C. Mann disputes that. He basically says, look, the jury's still out on that. It's more likely that it was brought from Europe, along with all the other diseases that did so much damage to the people. Next slide. These are mounted Utes. The Northern Ute acquired the horse from their cousins, Ute bands of southern Colorado who acquired them earlier from the Spanish. The horse transformed the culture. They became a mountain plains tribe. Next slide. Depredations occurred. James Goff recalled that the murder of the Indian was talked of at the time by many settlers, and that it was asserted that the men who killed the Indian ripped his bowels open and filled them with stones preparatory to sinking his body, a process called nepode, based on open. Now some folks claim this was what caused the Utah War. But note at the bottom, no one knows for sure, but it was either a broken no hunting treaty or an argument over a stolen shirt that inspired this murder. And this marked the beginning of depredations in Utah Valley, eventually leading to the Utah War of 1850. Next slide. The Utes, having access to horses were more aggressive of the Utah tribes, and consequently they resisted. Next slide. The Black Hawk War and Spanish Fork Treaty of 1865. This war was far more costly financially and the lives than originally believed. Recent research conducted by Philip Gottfredson, who interviewed many Mormon settlers of the central Utah area, indicates that the Utah Territory spent $1.5 million on the war, equivalent to $28.23 million in 2018. Mormon settlers were pushed out of 4 counties and over 70 settlements. Over 70 Utes and about 15 settlers lost their lives. It resulted in the removal of the Utes from Utah Valley. Next slide. The original homelands of the Utah Ute Indians was all points south and east of central Utah. Utah Valley, Sandpeat Valley, home to the Uintaats, Kamumbla, Timpanowats, Timpanogos, also referred to as Timpanogos, Sandpitch, Pavant, Chibarich bands of the Utah Indians. Again, 6 bands in all. A huge influx of Mormon settlers crossing through and staking homes and livestock and traditional food gathering areas caused the conflicts to rise. Territorial Governor Brigham Young negotiated the Spanish Fork Treaty of 1865 to remove them to the Uintah Valley. Now, this treaty was not ratified by Congress because Brigham Young, although he was considered a territorial governor, he did not represent the U.S. government officially, and only the federal government can authorize treaties with Indian tribes. So that treaty was not ratified. It was only when Abraham Lincoln adopted the executive order in 1861 that established the Uintah Valley Reservation. Next slide, please. I want to tell you about the Bear River Massacre because this was probably the largest massacre in the Western United States. Next slide, please. This was the 1840s. Settlers were pouring into traditional Shoshone land. By 1860s, overland passage increases as gold is discovered in California. Violence and food shortages lead to raids and small skirmishes in Idaho. California militia under Colonel Patrick Connor attacks innocent Shoshone camped on the Bear River near the Idaho-Utah border. Between 350 and 493 Shoshones of the Northwest Band are slaughtered. Food stores are taken after the massacre, while the dead are dumped in the river. This figure of 493 came to me from a family that claimed that their great-grandfather did the body count. And he documented it in a journal and donated to Brigham Young University's collections, special collections. And so we were able to get a typed copy of the count, but it was not the official version. So more research is needed. But if that is true, there were more Shoshone killed in the Bear River Massacre than the Sand Creek Massacre in Colorado and the Wounded Knee Massacre up north. So it's a significant event that took place. And the sadness is that we heard stories of, for example, this one survivor said that her great-grandmother said the soldiers were going around with bayonets, stabbing to make sure everyone was dead. And her great-great-grandmother took some kids and they jumped down in the river and hid under a bank. They had a baby with them and the baby started to cry. And so rather than risk being exposed, she had to drown the baby and let it float down the river. So there were tragedies like that that were shared as a part of this massacre. Next slide, please. Next slide, Heather. Okay. Mount Meadows with another tragedy, 1857. 60 members of the Fancher Baker Party, I'm sorry, 60 members of the Mormon militia committed the atrocities. 120 members of the Fancher Baker Party from Arkansas were exterminated. Several were executed, shot at the base of the skull. Next slide, please. Now, the Mormon version was that the Southern Paiute were responsible for the massacre of the Fancher Baker Party, 120 members who were on their way to California from Arkansas. After descendants of the Fancher Baker Party organized and began to research and share information, a book revealed testimony of children victims who stated that some of the Mormons were dressed as Indians. They witnessed them washing the paint from their bodies. This quote below is from a Paiute elder who was told the Paiute version. They said Indians don't leave their dead like this. They started blaming the Indians for it. The Paiute Indians around this area, they didn't know anything about what happened over there. They didn't even know nothing. They weren't no Indians around that place there. That's what takes place at that time. Us Paiute Nation got blamed for that. Clifford Jake, Paiute elder. Another tragedy. Next slide. These Fancher Baker people have a homecoming every year. Various families make a yearly trip to Utah to commemorate the loss of their descendants. I got to know some of these people. A very, very, very understanding people. They empathized with what happened to the native people in the state of Utah because they suffered some of it themselves. Next slide. Now, what we're talking about here is trauma, historic trauma. It's intergenerational because it's passed down. Trauma has been garnering more and more attention over the past few years with the rampant climb of post-traumatic stress disorder and the understanding of what caused it. Intergenerational trauma among American Indians is an area of study that has just started to generate attention from communities inside the Indian country, academia, and the medical profession. According to researchers, high rates of addictions, suicide, mental illness, sexual violence, and other ills among Native people might be at least in part influenced by historical trauma. Many present-day health disparities can be traced back through epigenetics to a colonial health deficit, the result of colonization and its aftermath. Bonnie Duran. Next slide, please. Trauma is an injury, a hurt, or damage caused by deep, disturbing experience. It can be physical, emotional, and spiritual, and may have a lasting impact. In fact, according to the book My Grandfather's Hands by R. Menachem, it's in the body. It gets in the body and it stays there. It's passed on intergenerationally until it is healed. Trauma can be passed, for example, to children. Active alcoholics are more likely to become alcoholics themselves or marry an alcoholic, thus putting their own children at risk. Historic trauma is cumulative, emotional, and psychological wounding from massive group trauma across generations. So again, we're learning more and more about trauma. Next slide, please. These are examples of trauma caused by dehumanization and racism. And this is what's found not only throughout what happened in Utah, but other parts of the country. Bloody violence, mass killings, rape, genocide, seizure of traditional lands, displacement, forced relocation, on reservations, banishment from traditional hunting and gathering territories, disastrous exposure to infectious diseases, on and on and on. I'm not going to go through all of these things in view of time, but these are all the result of the dehumanization policy that was adopted so many years ago. Next slide, please. Now, appreciation is extended to the Cyrus Dallin Art Museum for sponsoring this presentation. As a Native person from Utah, I'm grateful for Cyrus Dallin's outstanding contribution to the legacy of Native people. Cyrus claimed this was a sculpture of a chief named Standing Bear. He claimed he may have been Ute, but he probably was Shoshone. That's my guess, or Bannock. Next slide, please. This was produced in part by the Episcopal Church Office of the Indigenous Ministries. I borrowed some slides from them. We've been working together on this. We make this presentation throughout the states we occupy. Next slide. We lost a great scholar recently, and his name was Will Bagley. This presentation is dedicated to my friend and colleague, Will, who he was born in 1950 and he passed just recently. Much of the information in this presentation came from his work, which spanned many years. Most notable is his most recent book, The Whites Want Everything, 2020, and Blood of the Prophet, 2002. I consider him to be the most preeminent scholar in Western history in our area, following the late Dr. Floyd O'Neill, who was kind of the the godfather of Western history, and he is greatly missed too. But I'm feeling really sad for the loss of my friend, and I'm sure Greg Thompson is too. And Greg will appreciate my comments about Floyd because he was really the one that set the tone for what we do, what we know about history today in the state of Utah. Next slide, please. I think we're done. Thank you. Okay, I'll take questions now. Is everyone awake? How many did I put to sleep here?
No, that was really wonderful. Thank you so much. It's just so much to think about. It's a little overwhelming. That quote that you read about Brigham Young, when he said, "We are the people you have long awaited for." It reminds me of the motto on the original Massachusetts Bay Colony seal that showed a picture of a nude Indigenous person with the words over it, "Come on over and help us." And just the idea that this, starting with Columbus and the conquistadors and every colonizer after that, whiteness was just superior, and how many centuries it's taking us to kind of dismantle that way of thinking. Just last year, the state of Massachusetts passed a bill to change the state seal. It had moved from "come on over and help us" to "by the sword we seek peace," with a Native person in the middle and a downward pointing arrow. And so it takes centuries to dismantle this. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about how, given that we've adopted Indigenous Peoples Day in Arlington and more cities and towns. The city of Boston yesterday declared Indigenous Peoples Day. More and more states are doing it. You talk about that as being an important first step to create a space for healing and conversation. What are some things that you could suggest to us some steps that we could take right away to help with the healing of this trauma?
Well, I think changing the names of various landmarks, logos, quotations that are very inappropriate is the first step. But I think we must go deeper. What has happened in the past is to always look at the physical accoutrements of the Indian people, their culture. We've never really looked at the philosophy. We've never really gotten to know Indian people their true culture, their true beliefs, their true selves. Consequently, we've had a superficial relationship with Indian people, and it's kind of missed we haven't really gotten to know each other. So the next step is to engage in meaningful dialogue. And that's going to be kind of challenging to a lot of people. A lot of people are not going to want to do that because of their own miscalculated fears. But we have to stay at the table, we have to engage in each other, and we have to get to know each other for who we truly are. I heard the comment one day. A person said, you know, we haven't really let you in. We haven't let you in. And I thought about that and I said, that's true. We really don't know each other. We think we know based on superficial information, Hollywood depictions, outdated history. That's what we know. We don't really know who the Indian people truly are. We're just human beings, that's all. And our worldview was different than most Europeans. And it wasn't a matter of one worldview better than another. It's just different, that's all. They're just different. And I think what's critical to our country right now is we've run up against a wall. We've kind of run out of ideas and solutions. But I think if we stop and look back at some of those old beliefs that the indigenous people had, we might be able to find ourselves again. We might be able to find a balance or equilibrium here. The native people practiced one value. Carlos Barrios, in his book of Destiny, said that existed throughout the Western Hemisphere, and that value was generosity. They were socialist egalitarians who practiced generosity. And what our country is faced with right now is extreme greed and control and destruction of the earth, all for resources, for wealth. And we need to deal with that.
Thank you.
Excuse me, I don't have a hand raiser. I don't have a place to raise my hand on this Chromebook, but so I'm sorry to interrupt, but if you can hear me, I'd like to ask a question.
Go ahead, Mary.
Is that okay? It's Mary Lynn. Thank you.
Go ahead, Mary Lynn. Yes.
Hi. I'm just very moved and impressed by your presentation. And I agree with you on all of your conclusions about what needs to be done. And we're talking about revolution, so I'm not really sure how that process that people used to believe in the 60s, I don't know if it still has feet, but just in terms of the history, I wanted to ask you a couple things. I thought that Standing Bear was towards the end of his days anyway. He was in Nebraska, and he had to give up his Indian identity in order to be allowed back from the con job of moving into Oklahoma and to horrible territory, and then walking back through the winter and stuff. And anyway, he was given a piece of his land, I think in Nebraska, if he would deny his indigenous background. So he had to become, indigenous people couldn't be citizens, so he had to say he was a citizen. So that was one court case I remember, and I wondered if you knew anything about it in terms of Standing Bear. And the other question in terms of history is that my understanding is in the 1770s, well, you know, the war between the Americans and the British here was that the majority of indigenous people as well as Black slaves fought on the side of the British. Anyway, those are just a couple things I wondered if you had any historical comment on.
My understanding is they fought on both sides. They fought on both sides. In fact, my understanding, I'm a little rusty on this, but the Iroquois Confederacy was split in half over the Revolutionary War.
Huh.
I think that the English utilized them for intelligence, especially for waterways. And I think I can't remember which tribes, but eventually, when they decided to switch over and join the Americans, the English lost their intelligence on the waterways, and it was a big loss to them. And so my understanding is they were split, and some of the southern tribes the same way. Even in the Civil War, you had Native people fighting on both sides. So throughout the entire violent history of the United States, Native people have been involved, beginning from the Revolutionary War all the way to World War II. As you know, the Native code talkers played a big role in helping the Americans win that war. I hope I answered your question.
So did you have anything to say about Standing Bear and my understanding of his?
I'm rusty on that.
Okay.
I seem to recall now vaguely.
Yeah.
A little bit about his history. What do you remember? What tribe he belonged to?
I don't. I mean, that's why I was wondering when you were talking that. Well, the book Standing Bear as a Human Being or Standing Bear as a Citizen. I can't remember what it is. That kind of begins with him being in Nebraska, but that doesn't mean that was where his tribe was. He could have been forced from another area into the Nebraska area, but the government conned Standing Bear and other chiefs or leaders of bands or tribes to go down to Oklahoma, and they were going to beautiful country, and it turned out to be a horrible desert. So they literally had to walk back through the winter in their moccasins and barefooted and begging. And he was the only one who was allowed back on the land because he went to court, but in order to go to court, he had to be a citizen. So he had to deny his indigenous background.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with him.
It's just one sad story after another, but thank you so much for tonight.
You're welcome.
Julie in the chat says, I'm curious about the current status of the Ute and the hopes for the new leadership in the Interior Department. So the status of the Ute today and Deb Holland.
I'm sorry, what's the last part?
The new leadership in the Interior Department, Deb Holland, what you think about her?
We've heard good things about Deb Holland. Those of us that have been involved in government also, we know better than to to expect too much, because she's in a very, very controversial role with many demands, complex demands placed upon her. I think she's doing as good as she can do for the circumstances. Most of us have a positive outlook on her, and we wish her well.
And it sounds like Julie's also curious about the status of the Ute today.
She has been involved in the Bear's Ears controversy, and she went and visited the area. She's familiar with the circumstances involving the preservation of the area. We think she's probably going to rule in our favor. We don't know for sure. But she has not visited the Utes per se. She has met some of our leaders, but yeah, we feel comfortable with her.
And Karen is wondering if you could discuss conditions on the reservations. Karen, do you mean contemporary conditions today or historical conditions?
Conditions today.
Okay, it's very very complex because our people were displaced to a very arid part of the state, kind of a bowl area. It's called Uintah Basin. It happened to be an energy source of oil and gas, and since the 50s, our people have benefited from that development. it has created some conflict between the traditional leaders and the progressives. And the progressives have pretty much won out, and except for water. The traditionals will usually make a strong stand when it comes to water. But what's happened is the dependency on oil and gas royalties has created a dependency on a part of our people to kind of move away from developing themselves. So we have not really progressed as well as I would have liked to have us to be. And consequently, our government it struggles. It lacks competence in many areas, but they do the best they can. And for my part, I basically stay out of it. I kind of keep to myself and pursue scholarship as much as I can. And I'm always available to help them, but I see them basically not developing the way they should be. They're not utilizing their resources effectively. They lack sophistication in those areas. And so a lot of colonialism, they've been victims of colonialism par excellence. I think, as I mentioned earlier, the Mormon Church are so very dominant, paternalistic. They're very forceful people, and they're controlling people, and so they've really pretty much dominated the Ute people to the point where we have not really been able to fully develop ourselves. I think if we would have been allowed to adapt and borrow from both cultures at a slow rate, we would be better off. But where we were forced to conform to the dominant culture, it caused more trauma and set us back to a great degree. Now we have a lot of enterprises, a government, and we look good physically, but deep down we're still struggling.
And to that point, Mary Lynn, is as a follow-up, the relationship between the Mormons and the Ute people today. How do you learn to forgive?
It's not very good. It's very superficial. And I think the water is an example. The state of Utah and federal government basically did a lot of strategic planning and came up with a plan for taking the tribe's water for the most part, and ducting most of it to the Wasatch Front, and basically telling our people, well, we're going to have to rely on our water rights to the Green River and the Flaming Gorge Dam, and eventually replace our water that way. And we was in the water compact that was adopted. We don't have a lot of water rights except for recreational use. There's no documented claim on industrial farming use and other water rights. And so we're really handicapped when it comes to water. And it's because we've lacked the sophistication needed to defend ourselves in a very competitive society.
Sue says that the Washington Post just reported that Biden will restore full protections to 3 national monuments, including Bears Ears. So that's exciting.
Wonderful.
Thanks, Sue, for sharing that. Does anyone have any other questions? Yeah.
Deb Holland was largely responsible for that.
Just the end of that one question that I had asked, if you wouldn't mind. It's overwhelming to me. How do you, I know the Mormons weren't the only ones to commit atrocities against Native people in the United States, but how do your people, is it possible to forgive them? Because it's ongoing.
It's probably too late to acculturate effectively. Back when I was education director for my tribe, I recommended to the tribe to set up their own school system. And I told them, because they're so culturally at odds with the dominant culture, they are non-scientific. I said, you set up a school system and you appeal to the arts first. Art, music, dance, storytelling. You appeal to their artistic side, their healing side. And then by the time they're in the middle school area, start introducing math and science, and they will be ready for it then. They will pick it up, and then move them into the public school. And if you do that, transition them into the public school when they're ready, they'll feel less threatened, they'll adapt academically, and they will succeed. And they will eventually be prepared for college the same way the public school kids are. But no one listened to me. They kept forcing these round kids into square pegs, and they start pounding on them and said, how come these kids aren't learning? And I kept telling them they learn perfectly well, but they have different learning styles and different interests. So you can keep doing that. You're going to have a high dropout rate, and very few will succeed in college. You'll always have about 10% who will succeed in the public school system. And of the 10%, maybe you'll get 2 or 3% through college. But if you were to put together a more refined school system that encompasses their culture, then you will develop a highly effective school program that will not only benefit Indigenous people, Indian kids, but white kids as well, because there's always about 20% white kids that learn right brain. They learn differently. So, I mean, the solutions are out there, but the powers that be don't want them to take effect, or they don't understand, or I don't know what the resistance is. Maybe it's the devil. I don't know.
Thank you. I really appreciate your answer, and I'm getting also more clarity that forgiveness is not the issue. It's to end the oppression, the exploitation, and the discrimination. That's the focus. Forgiveness doesn't play a big part in this whole thing yet.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Anyone else have any questions for Forrest? Okay, well, I think we can wrap up. I'd just like to end with a note that if you would like to learn more about the history of the Indigenous nations of Utah, to pick up a copy of the book that Forrest edited, which is called A History of Utah's American Indian. And I read it, and it was extremely enlightening. A really good, important read, and it centers perspectives of Indigenous historians and Indigenous history, oral history, and Indigenous scholars. So that's my recommendation.
Heather, I also have another book coming out. It's called An Indian Way of Giving, and it's published by the Episcopal Church Press, and it's coming out October 19.
Oh.
And it's been getting the local priest and I teamed up on some stories that I've remembered over the years, and the focus is on dealing with promoting generosity, appreciation, and gratitude in our lives. And so I learned from some of the old traditional shaman and some of their philosophy and how it plays into daily life. And so most folks who have looked at the book are very pleased with it. So, An Indian Way of Giving by Forrest Cuch and Michael Kearney, Father Michael Kearney.
Oh, great. An Indian Way of Giving, and it'll be out this October. It's shortly,
Yes.
a couple of weeks. Forrest, I'll follow up with you on how to get copies of that, and I can email all of our participants the information if you're interested in purchasing it, and also the information for the other book that I mentioned, two of his.
I also want to put in a good word for my friend Dan Johnson. He's a good friend of Gregory Thompson and I, member of the Utah Westerners Association, and used to work with him when I was director of Indian Affairs for the state of Utah. He's a wonderful man, and he's doing his part to improve our country. And so I join with him and all the other scholars to do great work.
Thank you, Forrest. And for those of you who don't know Dan, he's one of our board directors, and he connected us with Forrest, and he's the reason why we're able to have this wonderful conversation with Forrest tonight.